Thanks everyone for joining us at today's RDA Tech Talk. The topic today will be moving SharePoint to the cloud. So as a brief overview of the new version of SharePoint, there's been significant improvements with SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint Online, and SharePoint Online is part of Office 365. This version of SharePoint with SharePoint Online focuses heavily on leveraging the cloud. And as you consider the next move to, or the move to the next version of SharePoint, there's a few questions that you need to ask yourself and answer. Primarily, what are the new features that are most critical to you? And then secondarily, how can I leverage those features in SharePoint, and how does the cloud play into my decision? So today we're going to be going over the new features of SharePoint, kind of at a high level, and then we're going to talk about SharePoint Online, and then discuss some topologies that you would want to consider so that you can include the cloud in your new SharePoint strategy. So what's new in SharePoint? SharePoint's got a whole bunch of new social features, from the news feed on your My Site area to which is kind of a microblogging experience. If you're not familiar with the term microblogging, it's sort of like the Twitter or Facebook wall kind of approach, but in SharePoint it's a more enterprise-focused social feature so that you can have conversations around your work or the documents that you're working on, or announcements that you want to make. There's also community sites, which is a significant improvement to the traditional sort of discussion boards and discussion sites that were previously available in SharePoint. And some of the common social features that you're used to on other social platforms, such as ratings and achievements, and you can like and follow people's comments and things like that. Those are all built into to the SharePoint community sites now. And then there's significant improvements to search, and maybe most importantly, the search web parts that are available. There's the search query web part, which is now available to potentially replace the content query web part. It allows you to use more commonly used technologies like HTML and JavaScript over the previous XSLT approach for the content query web part. A very, very big addition to SharePoint is the app model. Key to the app model is the ability to decouple your customizations from the SharePoint server itself, which gives your developers more power to deploy their solutions without having to rely on an administrator, while giving the administrators the ability to be confident that they have a predictable and more stable environment. And finally, claims-based authentication is the new standard for authentication on your web applications. So when you do your upgrade from previous versions of SharePoint, you'll need to make sure that you upgrade your databases to claims-based authentication. So a quick overview of SharePoint Online. There's some key terms that we'll probably be using a few times throughout this presentation, so it's good that you're all familiar with them. Office 365 is Microsoft's online solution for the Office product suite, and that includes the applications that you traditionally think of as part of Office, like Mail Client and Link and Word and Excel and PowerPoint. But it also includes some newer services like OneDrive for Business, which is kind of an ad hoc, personal storage, and Power BI, which is a really nice enhancement of for BI within the Office 365 suite, and Yammer, which is a big improvement on the social experience that Microsoft provides. So SharePoint Online is just a SharePoint offering within Office 365, and then we're going to use the term on-premises, which is a traditional approach to SharePoint farms. I'll also use the term on-cloud, which is kind of using the on-prem approach where you're actually managing the farm, but you're doing it on top of infrastructure as a service as opposed to SharePoint as a service. So it's a more familiar approach to managing SharePoint. It's just that the hardware or the virtual hardware that you're running off of is actually in the cloud. So let's talk about the pros and cons of on-premises, and like I said, this is the traditional approach to SharePoint. So the benefits are you have full administrative control. You have the full stack of development options. Even though you're encouraged to use SharePoint the app model in SharePoint 2013, you still have the traditional option. So if you don't have the time to upgrade or port your functionality to apps, your old solutions should still be able to install. There might be some minor fixes and some testing that you'll want to do before you put them into production SharePoint 2013 environment, but by and large they should move over relatively easily. And then finally you have the infrastructure control. And that's down to the network level, the machine hardware, like your disk choices, the disk performance. So anything you can think of in terms of hardware and infrastructure, you have potential control of that because it's sitting on premises within your network. The limitations are traditionally getting a 99.9% uptime is fairly expensive, and you'll need to have a pretty decent skill set and multiple people who have those skill sets involved to keep SharePoint up and running and as fault tolerant as a 99.9% uptime would require. And then finally, you have the legacy solution-based development that we talked about, which is nice in terms of upgrading to SharePoint 2013. You're having to do less work, having your developers have to do less work to get there. But those traditional legacy solutions can and have demonstrated that they can break upgrades, and they potentially put the farm into a less stable state because you're trusting the code to run on the server, potentially with full control on the server to do whatever you want them to do. So that's nice and it's powerful, but it also can be dangerous. Now we're going to talk about the benefits and limitations of on-cloud, which is the infrastructure as a service option I spoke about earlier. Essentially just your hardware is being hosted in the cloud, and then on top of that hardware you install everything that you need to do. The benefits and limitations are largely the same, with the difference being under the benefits you have infrastructure configuration. You don't necessarily have full control of your infrastructure because it's actually being managed by the cloud service provider. And then the limitations are getting 99% uptime, 99.9% uptime is potentially less expensive, but it's still because of some of the SLAs that are provided by the cloud service provider. But it really depends on how that infrastructure as a service provider allows you to configure things. And you'll still need the same number of hands pretty much and the skill sets to keep SharePoint up and running because most of it is your responsibility. Like the operating system patching may be your responsibility. SharePoint patching is definitely going to be your responsibility. Installation of SharePoint, configuration of SharePoint, all of that is, the entire farm's configuration is still totally up to you. You still have the same upgrade concerns with legacy solutions and the farm stability concerns with the traditional solution-based development. One thing that we would add to this conversation is that our recommendation today is in this order for if you're considering infrastructure as a service, and that's Amazon Web Services first, then Azure second, and then the other providers, and there's a number of other providers, but the two big players right now are AWS and Azure in terms of where you should host your SharePoint environment. The reason why AWS is sitting on top right now is because of performance of disk. Microsoft has recently announced that they are improving their disk performance options. However, that's not widely available right now. In addition, there are a number of features that the independent Gartner group has sort of assessed, and Amazon is about 20% better in terms of the required features, and then they're a bit better in the nice-to-have features as well. So it's important to kind of reassess if you're thinking about doing an infrastructure as a service move in the near future. You would want to kind of reassess how Gartner is rating things, how the rest of the community is rating things too. But if you were doing it, if you're starting today with your SharePoint upgrade, we would suggest AWS as your first choice. So now we talk about the benefits and limitations of SharePoint Online. As we said, SharePoint Online is a SharePoint service inside of Office 365. SharePoint Online allows you to focus on customizing SharePoint for your business, and you reduce the amount of plumbing overhead. And what I mean by that is that you're not going to have to do the installation of SharePoint. You're not going to have to do the configuration of the operating system. SharePoint is up and running within Office 365. You're just given a tenancy, and you can have multiple site collections within that tenancy that you manage, but you're really operating at a much higher level than you would if you were starting from scratch with SharePoint. And so it allows you to focus on the business-specific issues and lets Microsoft focus on the SharePoint sort of plumbing and underlying issues. You get automatic updates with SharePoint Online. And you have two options there. If you want to be cutting edge, you can get the updates applied automatically and immediately when they're available, or you can wait a couple weeks. I think it's 3 weeks right now. So you can kind of see how those updates are affecting other people and kind of put your ear to the tracks and decide, if there's something that you need to do in that 3 week time period from when, the first adopters are getting it and when you'll get it. Within SharePoint Online for development, you have to use apps or, more simple out-of-the-box solutions like putting JavaScript and HTML into content editor web parts. But for the most part, you kind of focus on app development. And what that means is it's a sort of a lower bar for entry. You're going to be using a lot of HTML and JavaScript. And these are very familiar technologies to just your average web developer. You won't necessarily need a SharePoint developer to do some of this stuff. And then also fault tolerance, disaster recovery, and uptime are all baked in. And we'll go into a bit more detail on that. But it's nice to know that because you're operating at this higher level and all the infrastructure and SharePoint baseline stuff is taken care of for you, the stability of SharePoint is sort of more Microsoft's responsibility than it is yours. The limits are site collection admin is kind of the level that you'll be administering SharePoint at. And if you're familiar with SharePoint, you kind of understand the difference between what a site collection administrator is and a farm administrator who has a lot more control over the farm. So you kind of have to consider, it is a more limited role, but also it's a safer role to be in. There's also a limitation to cross-site collection functionality and the way that you have those things interact. And what I mean by that is more like traditionally, if we wanted to do something that applied to all the site collections within a SharePoint web application, we would create a web application scope feature. And you can't do that anymore, so you'll have to figure out new techniques for applying things to multiple site collections. And finally, the current guidance is to limit branding. And that's mostly because of the branding guidance right now being a little shaky. But we do have plenty of experience with branding SharePoint Online. And so combining some of our internally developed approaches and sort of the greater SharePoint community guidance for branding, we've come up with several effective approaches that our customers can consider. So now that we've talked about all the different approaches, SharePoint On-Prem, SharePoint on Cloud, and SharePoint Online, let's talk a little bit about hybrid. And a hybrid topology is a very interesting option for many people who want to move to the cloud, but aren't necessarily ready to tackle all that's involved in moving fully to the cloud, or then have specific business requirements that sort of prevent them from fully moving everything into a service like SharePoint Online. But in many cases, some of their workloads can be moved to SharePoint Online, making them easier to manage and keep stable. So there are three types of hybrid. The first one, as you see the screen line on the top, sort of illustrates the outbound hybrid topology, and that basically allows for internal consumption of external content. For example, if I had to an extranet that I hosted within SharePoint Online, and then I had an internal portal that was an on-premises version of SharePoint server, I could search internally on my SharePoint server and get results from the SharePoint Online extranet. The other approach is the inbound connection, which is sort of the reverse of what I just described in the outbound, where users within the Office 365 SharePoint Online world could actually search and get results for something, probably not everything internally, but you could expose certain pieces of your internal SharePoint farm to SharePoint Online. This is a bit more complex from a configuration standpoint because you'll need to work with network security and some of your infrastructure people to ensure all the security concerns are reviewed. And then if you'll notice, there's a perimeter network kind of zone in the middle here on the right that shows a reverse proxy server down at the bottom. And so you'll definitely want to have a reverse proxy that the SharePoint Online to internal farm communication goes through to abstract away some of the details of your internal network for security purposes. And then finally there's the two-way, which is basically just the inbound plus the outbound. So if you configure your inbound, you're most of the way to a two-way hybrid. Using the two-way hybrid approach sort of gives you the ability potentially to give users who have access to both places sort of a unified experience. If you brand it properly and you kind of deal with the navigation, the users won't really care where they are. They can just get to things and find things using search and other, navigation and things like that, so that they don't need to really worry about, well, now I'm in the extranet, now I'm in the internet, I'm just doing work. So in order to achieve that really unified experience, you really need to create a user experience that helps them to keep things simple from a user perspective. So a little breakdown of, in a hybrid scenario, which sort of workloads and concepts go better in which environment, or go very well in which environment. If you have some basic team sites and collaboration sites, Office 365 is a great place for that, because it's the default SharePoint experience. You're not going to maybe heavily customize things. You just want to give people document libraries and lists and things like that. Well, if you put it into SharePoint Online, your responsibility to manage the overhead and back that stuff up is gone. You can let Microsoft do that. For extranet users, by default, you can set up an account for somebody, and they can come in and get into your Office 365 environment, any area that you've given them rights to, and they can log in and get into SharePoint Online just like any other user. Remote divisions, also sort of similar to an extranet scenario. You might want to consider that. If you need to develop customizations, you can stick to the app model, and it should deploy to SharePoint Online just as well as it deploys to on-prem or on-cloud services. The Power BI product is actually only available within SharePoint, within Office 365, so it's a cloud-only product. OneDrive for Business, there's unlimited storage in the cloud, so that's a nice perk. Otherwise, you have to kind of come up with the storage yourself for each of your users. The Yammer social experience is also an experience that only exists within the Office 365 environment. In the on-prem or on-cloud approach, if you have legacy code or legacy SharePoint farm solutions that you're not ready to port, and you really need to do an upgrade to the next version of SharePoint, the custom code should be able to still run in the on-prem environment. SharePoint 2013 is largely backward compatible with all the SharePoint 2010 customizations that you may have made. Anything that's sensitive or regulated, you talk to your compliance and your records managers and legal departments, and just ensure that any data that needs to stay on premises or within a certain geography actually stays there. Some Power Pivot and BI things have not been fully implemented, or potentially if you want to connect to internal data sources, you'll need to keep those internal data sources on premises. The provider hosted app hosts, one of the things that we probably won't go into too much detail because it's more of a developer concept, but if you do need to do something that SharePoint Online doesn't offer, you need a little bit more power, you can create custom application servers that run your custom code that your SharePoint apps can then connect to. So if you have your SharePoint app and your user interface code running within SharePoint Online, it can actually connect back to a backend that you're providing on premises. And then finally, to give that sort of consistent and unified user experience, federation makes a lot of sense. So you can do AD federation so that you kind of give your internal users a single sign-on experience. Alternatively, you can do an Active Directory sync where the internal stuff is replicated out. And then you can do federated search so that you can search from one place but get results from many different places, including SharePoint Online. And if you did the two-way hybrid, you could do online back into the internal network as well. So some key considerations for Office 365 versus on-prem or on-cloud. You want to consider the features, how you can customize, the contractual service level agreements that you need, which include the availability and the storage requirements that you have, anything compliance related or information security related, the upgrade and migration effort, and then also the cost. So from a feature standpoint, we couldn't possibly go through all the features, probably not in several days. We wouldn't be able to go through the features that you'd have to consider, because there are just an absolute ton, as many people know, of features in SharePoint. And now that there's two different versions of the product, well, two distinctly different versions of the product, the on-prem and the SharePoint Online. There's even more sort of features and which environment to use, decisions that need to be made. So Microsoft does provide a really good product and feature matrix. It's sort of a BI-based solution, and you can kind of go in and choose different facets and narrow down and filter out the results and look at everything. It's a very big list, but it's a nice tool to sort of start with. So you should check that out. That's available at this TechNet link. From a customization perspective, we talked about this a little bit, but if I can't do something with SharePoint out of the box, you have to ask yourself, how can you meet your business need for customization? And the answer in SharePoint, the newest version of SharePoint, should always be apps, whether it's on-prem or SharePoint Online. And the reason is because you get the environmental stability of not deploying custom code and having it run on the server. It also adopts a more modern development, service-oriented architecture approach. And like we said, the modern development approach is really involving HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So a lot of web developers, standard web developers, not SharePoint developers, are familiar with this. And so you can either go out and look for web developers, which are a little bit easier to find than SharePoint developers. And you may already have some web developers within your organization who could use SharePoint as another platform for which they develop solutions. And finally, the salary requirements for a SharePoint developer typically are a bit higher annually than a standard web developer. Next is SLAs. So with SharePoint Online, you get a 99.9% uptime baked in. And the way that they guarantee this is with a financial backing. If it's less than 99.9% uptime over the course of a month, you get a 25% credit on your bill. If it's less than 99, it's a 50% credit. And if it's less than 95, you get a full credit for that month. And what that means, the 3 nines, is, I believe, 42 minutes of downtime, 42 or 44 minutes of downtime per month. Now, Microsoft is actually running presently, the last time I checked it was 99.95, I believe. So that's actually twice as good as that, around 20 minutes of downtime per month. So you kind of have to ask yourself, are we able to kind of provide and test for that to guarantee that you're doing it on-prem as well as Microsoft is doing it in their SharePoint Online product. In addition, the disaster recovery point objective is 45 minutes, meaning that you'll lose no more than 45 minutes worth of work. And it's a 2-hour recovery time objective, which means that after a disaster occurred and SharePoint Online went down, within 2 hours they would have your data back up. Next is compliance and regulatory. So the first thing we'll talk about is the Office 365 Trust Center. Similar to the feature listing, the Office 365 Trust Center has just a ton of information on several categories, so security and privacy and compliance and uptime. It's definitely worth your while to dig in and ask the questions, or look for the answers to the questions that you have related to these topics within the Office 365 Trust Center, because there's just like I said, tons of information there to kind of get you feeling more comfortable about all the things that Microsoft's doing. So a little bit more about security. A lot of people say, can I trust SharePoint Online? So one thing to surface that isn't advertised quite as much is the Microsoft sort of approach to securing their data centers. The first is with Microsoft employees, they get the background checks. There's least privilege access set up, meaning, for those who aren't familiar, least privilege access gives people only the rights they need to perform the job that they have to do. So no one gets full admin rights if they don't really need it. If anybody does need elevated rights, they have just-in-time access, meaning that it's a time-boxed elevated access being granted, and it's only for a limited duration. So that means that a person has to approve any kind of additional rights that someone should have to go in and do something within the SharePoint data center. And even though it's granted, it gets timed out after a certain period of time, so that there's no accidental leaving somebody in a group and forgetting that they have access to something that maybe they shouldn't have access to all the time. Then they have the physical security, gates, armed guards, IDs, and biometric devices. There's also auditing of data leaving the facility, which is an important consideration for most people. There's protection against the man-in-the-middle attack by SSL encrypting all the data from the data center to the endpoint. And then there's data loss prevention, and that can, that's data loss in two ways. Data loss after a disaster is protected by having 4 copies of runtime that are geo-replicated in case of a disaster. And then there's the data loss because of you or one of your users, where, and so everybody's sort of familiar with the recycle bin. And those still exist within SharePoint Online. But if you decided to delete something from the recycle bin, your data is actually archived for 90 days. And that's done for free, but you do have to pay to get the data back. So you can sort of rest assured that you won't lose your data, but there is a cost associated with having to retrieve something from the archive if you've cleaned it out of your recycle bin. There's a full list of regulatory compliance for Office 365 on TechNet. So check this link out if you're interested. But as you see, there's a whole lot of yeses in here for many common compliance concerns. The next is the migration effort. So a migration to SharePoint Online doesn't work the same way as a migration to SharePoint 2013. Many of us, if we're moving to SharePoint 2013, are very familiar with the database attach method. You just set up your new SharePoint farm, you attach your databases, you check them for compatibility, remediate any issues, and then you're kind of ready to sort of upgrade and have your new SharePoint 2013 farm with all your old data in it. SharePoint Online doesn't have that option, so you need to use custom techniques, third-party tools, and then a bit of manual effort and planning to get your data migrated into SharePoint Online. So all the benefits that you get when you get to SharePoint Online are still the same as we've been describing, but getting yourself there is kind of a new challenge that our customers have to be aware of. Finally, the costs. So there is a cost associated with SharePoint Online, just like there's a cost associated with infrastructure as a service, because it's a service being provided to you. And we can't go into the details of exactly how the licensing works, because it really depends on the level of or the license that you're trying to get for your organization. But we can help you work with Microsoft to determine the cost for SharePoint Online for you. So you have to ask yourself, does the reduction in administrative overhead and the infrastructure reduction, the actual hardware reduction, the availability that they provide, and the reduction in the skill set or the requirement for SharePoint skills, and leveraging your existing workforce sort of outweigh any new costs that are incurred through your subscription fees. So now let's talk a little bit about integrations. So there's a couple things that integrate very well with SharePoint on-prem and SharePoint online. OneDrive for Business. It's kind of the name for the personal storage for users' documents, and people who are familiar with other sort of cloud file system providers like Dropbox or Google Docs or something like that should be pretty comfortable in the OneDrive space. It's basically a personal online storage for business users. You can have your OneDrive for Business in the cloud, or you can set it up on-prem. It's available through your My Site, and it offers the ability to store sort of unstructured data like documents and things like that you're not quite ready to move into SharePoint and organize in a more sort of strict fashion maybe. So you can work on them, you can share them out to other users and collaborate from within there, but it's a little looser than the SharePoint collaboration experience. And it gives you the offline sync, which is a pretty nice feature. previous versions of SharePoint had the ability to take your content offline, but the OneDrive for Business really gets it right. You just kind of go in, hit a sync button, you get your content, you can go take it home, work on it offline. When you get back, hit the sync button again, and everything kind of goes back to where it was. And that's a bit nicer than the previous offline feature of SharePoint. The Yammer product is, as we said before, the Office 365 social experience. It's an enhanced social experience over the out-of-the-box SharePoint social features. One of the things that's important is, all this nice power that they build into Yammer. Some of those features might actually get rolled into an update for SharePoint on-prem, but Microsoft has stated that several of the features just won't make it because, for whatever reason, it doesn't make any sense to have it. Maybe these are features that integrate with other Office 365 products, or it just applies to a larger audience. But some of those features may never come to the on-prem social experience. So if you want to have the most fully featured, most up-to-date social experience, Yammer really is the social experience to choose. Also with Yammer, there's some fairly cool web parts that allow you to sort of drop the conversations that you're having in Yammer next to the content that you're using in SharePoint. So it's sort of a more cohesive experience. And then finally, Power BI. That's another topic that we could probably spend quite a bit of time showing off. There's some really cool visualizations that you can come up with using Excel and the Power BI product, and also the collaborative experience on top of that includes your BI solutions is really very nice. So if you haven't seen anything with Power BI, you should really check it out. It really integrates with SharePoint very nicely, sort of identifies documents that are in SharePoint that you can include in your Power BI sites, and there's a really, really neat Q&A feature which allows you to do a natural language query and get visualizations of your data on the fly. The next thing we'll talk about is Delve. So if you've moved your information and if you're working out of Office 365, then there's all this data in these different Office 365 products that's related to you, that things you've developed or your coworkers have developed, that's in Office 365. So what Delve does is it helps you to connect these different silos, these different products together, so that you get meaningful things about you. If you want to know. If you're working on a project and there's Word documents and there's PowerPoints and there's Excel documents and there's SharePoint content, you really kind of might want to see all that in the same place and discover new things that are related to you. So what Delve does is it takes advantage of an underlying sort of crawl of your content, and it surfaces interesting information about that content. Similar to these content trends that Delve can show, it also shows people trends. So if you're doing a search for people, it gives you some pretty interesting connections that sort of determines lots of interesting information about the people that you work with and people that you are somehow connected to that you may not have realized you were connected to. Maybe you're both working on the same type of thing, and that's important to know for some companies. Finally, we just showed two pretty cool visualizations of Delve, but the underlying data source for what Delve surfaces is the Office graph. So what happens is that Microsoft defines its different products as sort of signals, and then the Office graph goes through and indexes all those signals and then uses machine learning to infer connections and important things about that information and you. The Office graph really is the underlying powerful data source, and Delve is really just the visualizations. And what that means, or what's important about that, is that Delve is a really nice product. It kind of shows a nice sort of package of functionality off to you, but your developers will have API access to the Office graph too. So if Delve shows things one way, but you want to show it a different way, your developers can go in there and create custom solutions that leverage the Office graph. So the bottom line is that the cloud is on fire, and these are the words of a Microsoft Office manager. And I think that's pretty well known at this point. People are talking about the cloud all the time, trying to reduce the amount of infrastructure that's maintained on site, keeping only the critical things on site, or only the things that are absolutely necessary to keep, and then letting these cloud services provide a simplification of the overall IT environment that they have to maintain. As we said, also in many instances, a lot of the new features that you're seeing introduced into the cloud may get rolled into updates to the different Microsoft products, but in many cases their focus really is purely on the cloud, so those things won't be available. So you're going to have to go to the cloud to really use everything that's new and great that's coming out. And then finally, like we said before, I think the simplicity that SharePoint Online provides sometimes makes it a no-brainer for certain workloads, but in certain cases it won't work. So you might not be able to completely give up your entire SharePoint farm, but your SharePoint farm should get simpler. So figure out what cloud services you can leverage, and then maybe consider the hybrid environment so that your on-prem responsibilities are lower, if that's possible. We have a quick reference section here, kind of just some general information about the hybrid model, which is definitely worth a read, and it kind of goes into the general, then for business and IT decision makers, and then the technical decision makers to sort of review that stuff. Once again, we'll show you the Trust Center link here. It's a good thing to look at for the compliance and security concerns. And then there's a very quick video that you can watch for cloud security within Office 365 by the CTO of Office 365. So you should check that out if you want just a quick review. And there's a nice pre-migration checklist that's available through the Metalogix website. Metalogix is a company that provides one of the third-party migration tools. But they give their pre-migration checklist away for free, so it kind of gives you a better sense of what you can expect in a SharePoint migration. Finally, we have just this last slide. If you have any questions or concerns, you can feel free to send me an email if you have technical questions. If you have questions that you want to ask marketing, maybe about engaging with us, you can contact marketing at this email address, or you can give us a call, visit our website, rd80corp.com, or join up with us at LinkedIn just by clicking this link or visiting this link. And if you'd like a copy of the presentation or ask any additional questions, please join up and we'd be happy to help you. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and please keep up with RDA and attend our next Tech Talk if you have an opportunity. Thanks again.